I think I want to do all the sex stuff first and then do marriage. Don't copy this doodle down. This is from an 1897 book that was trying to document sexuality and sexual practices in other places, but it probably says more about the European Victorian mindset about how they were weirded out by certain things or thought they were weirded out. But this was something that anthropologists did, is to try and figure out how much sexuality mattered and what kinds of it were accepted in human societies. And they only found one thing that was observed to be consistent across societies. I don't know if they talked about this, maybe because you don't want to talk about it so early. So I remember what the one thing that it was in common across all societies in terms of things that people didn't like or wanted to prohibit. Yes. Incest. Yes. All societies have a what is called an incest taboo. Now, where exactly that line is drawn, it can vary between societies, but you don't want to be in all societies. There's an idea that you shouldn't be having sexual relationships with people that are too closely related to you. But all kinds of other things were fine. And so in the past and in other societies, all kinds of other funny things and everything you wanted to know about sex is probably done or in some cases even considered normal. Now, when we look at these societies, one of the things we have to be careful of is that we would look at, from our perspective, our contemporary, a modern US perspective, you might say, we would say that they are normalizing or they think it's fine to do things that we would think of as same-sex relationships. But you have to be really careful here because that doesn't necessarily mean just because people are doing things with each other and taking actions with each other, that doesn't mean they identify in the ways that we have put on our identities. As one of you used this in your quiz, as gay or straight. Those are actually very modern identities. The first use of the term heterosexual didn't come up until about 120 years ago. So the whole idea that you would identify and the whole identity of being gay, like as an identity saying I am or I am not, really didn't emerge until after the 1950s or so. So that's not to say that people weren't having sex with other people, same-sex relationships, temporarily or extended. It's just that that wasn't necessarily an identity that people would assert for themselves. And this is just a cautionary exercise. We don't want to take our labels for things and assume that other people have the same labels, but it actually can have public health consequences. What happens when we just assume that people are one way or another? Okay, so some of these, and this would happen both in our own society and other societies, they would say men would not identify as being gay and might have a family and consider themselves to be straight, but would still have sex with other men. And so there was a public health mismatch there because resources were being focused on one form without considering the whole spectrum of what people were doing. So basically, when we look at both past societies, other societies, and even within our own society, we want to be careful to distinguish these kinds of identity formations that people have and may or may not identify with, and the actual activities that they are doing. So, yeah, you gotta love archaeology there. This is actually an object that is from what is now Peru, but was in ancient Peru. But we have to be really careful about interpreting the depictions of people without any written records for what they might have been thinking. So actually, this comes up, for example, a lot of you may know that in Greece and Rome, there are depictions of especially male same-sex relationships, and people basically assume that that meant that the Greeks or the Romans were accepting of same-sex desire. But that's not exactly like once you look at as they say, once you look at this is on page 349, written records have helped to contextualize the images, this is from classical Greece, Rome societies, and suggest that same-sex attraction as we understand it today didn't exist in the classical Greek and Roman worlds. Rather, many men participated in sexual acts with other men, and any stigma that came from such actions did not accrue solely to men. Anyone penetrated during sex was stigmatized. So there's a whole different form of who is thought to be. There wasn't necessarily an identity again as gay or straight, and it would be the form of sex and who is doing the penetrating and who was being penetrated would be more of the person who was being stigmatized or had some sort of identity put upon them. And so what we want to be careful of is, again, we don't want to project our own ideas of what something might be as pornography or as homosexuality onto the past, especially if we have no idea what people might have been thinking here. In fact, where was this object or objects like this found? Buried with high status people. Yeah, and so it's, again, this doesn't necessarily suggest that this was something that was necessarily going on in that society. This may sound strange, but it may mean that they were symbolizing the transfer of resources from one generation to another. And that's why you find these things in these high status tombs. So it's not necessarily being used as something to look at or practice on or represent society. It's more like maybe it's something that's suggesting a transfer of power or wealth down the line. So we just don't know. And so what we do know is that people do all kinds of interesting things all over the world, but we don't necessarily know what they mean, and we don't want to project our own meanings onto them. One of the things that comes up in this chapter and where people have projected their own meanings onto things was the famous discovery in Italy of what were called the lovers of Modena, because there they are, two skeletons buried in an embrace or holding hands or something. Who are these people? So this was assumed to be a man and a woman, and now they've figured out that it's a man and a man. But who knows? Maybe they're just hugging each other. We don't know that they identified as gay or straight or anything like that. We just know that we have two male skeletons buried together. There they are. When we assume that this is a man and a woman buried together, what is that called? We're just look at those people loving each other. What heteronormativity? There's no way to remember that word. Heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is when we assume that that's a man and a woman together because that would be the normal thing that people would be doing. And so whenever we find two skeletons buried together in an embrace, then that's normal, man and woman, we would say. And we would think that other things are out of the range of normal or abnormal, or they don't just even enter our thought process at all. We don't even think about them. So this is what is known as heteronormativity. And you can get really into this, or there's all sorts of things to explore here for the implications for our society. They give you a great little diagram about what may be a more accurate depiction of all the ways that people do gender, sex, all these things. So this is on page 349. You can try to locate yourself somewhere along this great diagram. And this might be your only chance. Next semester, all this stuff is going to be taboo. I'm not going to be able to teach this anymore because this is all gender, sex, insanity. And so take your time, locate yourself, take your book home. Better buy the physical copy of it. It's probably going to disappear. Anyway, I wanted to do all the sex stuff before we talk about the marriage. So I'm jumping ahead now to page 371, the last section, which is about sex work in a globalized world. Basically, in some ways, in part because human sexuality is so expansive and we do all kinds of things and we want to do all kinds of things which aren't necessarily sanctioned by our society, we tend to start paying people, or certain people want to pay people to do other things they might not be able to do. What do you think? Should this be legal? Maybe that's not a bad idea. Yeah, I don't know. You've probably heard that sex work is the oldest profession. This has been around for a very long time, let us say, and it's probably going to happen anyway. And as your textbook says, one of the biggest places of sex work and sex trafficking in our own society and in the world is at the Super Bowl. So if it's happening at the Super Bowl, it's happening everywhere. And in some countries, like you mentioned in Germany, I mean, there's all sorts of dangers associated with sex work, but if you make it legal and you have state regulations and you make sure that people are old enough and all those things, then it can become relatively safe. Now, that doesn't mean it is necessarily something that doesn't mean it doesn't have any stigma attached to it, even in places like Germany or in Amsterdam or places where it is legalized. It's often people who come in from other countries, so people who are probably in some ways being exploited there, and are stigmatized, but it's perhaps not as dangerous and unequal as it can be in places where it is happening, but is not, is illegal. What happens in today's world, or is probably been happening for a long time, is that people also will try to travel or to do what is called sex tourism in order to find different kinds of relationships. And a lot of this is an exoticization. That is, it plays up the exoticness of other people. And it is probably a very unequal relationship as people are traveling outside of their home and then looking for sex for payment. One of the interesting things your textbook notes here, though, is that although this is usually seen as something that men do and go to other places to find women, it actually, again, and this is not necessarily that all genders are equally doing this, but it can involve women traveling as well or going to certain places. And your textbook gives us a picture from the Caribbean where this has become relatively common, where people from mainly European countries go to places like the Dominican Republic or Haiti, when we used to be able to travel there, and try to find these kinds of relationships. A lot of these relationships are quite exploitative and dangerous and unequal. What's interesting, though, is that oftentimes if you talk to the people who are doing the sex work, the sex workers themselves, they don't necessarily all see themselves as being exploited. So many of them see this as something that they are doing on their own as a way to get by, as a way to make money, even be entrepreneurial. Now, that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean this is a good thing, or it doesn't mean that people are not trafficked and don't want out of this in many cases, but it means that we have to be careful in our assumptions that people are only being exploited, or that people are automatically going to want to not be a part of this as they're doing it. So, at least in one of the big themes of this chapter is to talk about the expansiveness of human sexuality and how people try to regulate it, and how people try to make different identities and interpret that as people are living their lives.